you get everyone spending half their time thinking, how can we basically skirt around the edge of it, i.e. not really comply with the spirit of this thing and just do the bare minimum and then still keep doing what we feel like.
How can we exploit this by offering GDPR advisory services?
Yes, yeah. I mean, that was
GDPR merch.
I mean, that must have been such a...
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. As ever, I have with me Jamie and we've got Ray from Light Reading joining us. Thanks a lot, Ray.
Thank you.
Just consulting your notes.
Is that over already?
Yeah. Well, just you being here is a podcast enough. But then we know that you're going to bring some extra super duper insight later on. So in the meantime, Jamie and I will just fill the gaps.
And not just snow blindness from the shirts.
Yeah, you've got your special podcast shirt on. Sorry, those who are listening, you're missing out on a sort of force of nature here. Right, what are we going to... Oh, yes, and just to remind you that if you are listening, you can also watch it on the site or on Facebook, and if you're watching, you can listen on SoundCloud or iTunes. So this week, we're going to talk about regulation. I know, isn't that exciting? And then we're going to talk a little bit about what Nokia's been up to.
I hope I'm not talking about regulation.
Well, we expect you to at least
pretend to it.
To at least feign interest.
All right, I'll try.
It's inspiring when I'm doing my opening spiel to see both of you on your phones. I feel this is a really collaborative exercise.
I'm checking what my job title
is. Head of checking things. Anyway, and Ray's going to talk about some stuff later that's going to be to do with cloudy business. Virtualization. Okay. So regulation, not quite as boring as it sounds, I hope. We've had a couple of sort of major regulatory things going on, probably the biggest one being GDPR, which stands for General Data Protection Regulation, I believe.
Yes.
And for those thank you, Jamie. And for those of you who haven't been paying attention for whatever reason, Europe's decided that everything's got to change regarding how companies hold on to your data, from things like sort of mailing list subscriptions and marketing, and pretty much affects everything to how most people do business these days, because it's normally around sort of communicating via email or whatever. And everyone had plenty of warning, but they were still kind of themselves leading up to the big day, which was a week ago.
Oh, was it?
And so now we've had a week of it actually being in effect. So I guess what I want to start off by talking about is, how's it all going? And I wrote a piece yesterday saying that and this isn't at all surprising, by the way, it seems to have benefited the biggest companies. Because whenever you lay a big load of extra bureaucracy on the business world, it's the biggest companies with the most resources, the most lawyers, the biggest economies of scale that can normally adapt to it quicker and exploit new opportunities that come from it quicker. And so there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal that I read and commented on where they reckon that Google and Facebook, who are already the dominant global advertisers, have, if anything, found their position to be even stronger as a result of GDPR, because smaller sort of ad platforms, smaller aggregators, smaller advertisers themselves have been slower to sort of get their ducks in a row and tick all the right boxes for GDPR. And the European Commission has a long history of being quite spectacularly vindictive when it hands down a directive and people don't stick to it. It likes to lay big fines on them, which it then all that money goes into a central pool, which is spent on lunches for the European commissioners, because they're really short of opportunities to do that.
Shots fired.
So that's been the thing that's happened. And then there's been one other bit of sort of collateral damage. At the same time, we've spoken about this a few times on the pod, there's sort of aggro going on in the US to do with trade. That's always been one of Trump's big things, is protectionism. It's been mainly pointed at China, and so we've spoken about it a fair bit in the context of ZTE. But just this week he's announced a bunch of tariffs on Europe and Canada and Mexico to do with steel and aluminium. And then also another thing I reported on there, I can't remember what his precise, one of the secretaries of state in the US called Wilbur Ross, I think, wrote a piece in the Financial Times going GDPR is really cocking things up for relations between the US and the EU. So it seems like GDPR's even become a pawn in this great big sort of global protectionist game. So that's my sort of opener on regulation. Jamie, I think you wrote about some other sort of regulatory larks this week as well, didn't you?
Yeah, so it's basically like the GDPR being an absolute cluster as no surprise. I mean, everyone's had 2 years basically to warm up to it, and even so, I attended events. I think it was last June, last July, and I spoke to a consultant who, I mean, he said it to me off the record, so I'm not going to say where he's from. But he turned around and said, yeah, like there's going to be so many fines when it comes into place because no one has started, none of their clients had actually started the auditing process.
Yeah.
So even back, 12 months where you think you've got a load of time, he said it's going to take so long to actually go through all your systems and understand what data you actually have. Because they were literally, all these companies have just been grabbing every aspect of some personal lives as they can, and then just storing it and not bothering, picking out the bits they like, and then not bothering to get rid of or do anything with the stuff that they can't use.
Which is one of the reasons this stuff came into effect, because it's been so sort of wild, hasn't it?
Well, they got to get better at managing what they have and protecting what they have. So he just said, even 12 months ago, he was looking forward, and he's saying, the last 2 months before this deadline goes in, it's just going to be an absolute panic because no one's actually doing the really labour-intensive work now. So I've got little surprise. One of my drinking buddies commented about 3 or 4 months ago when we were watching one of the Six Nations matches that basically he works for another large consultancy which shall remain nameless.
Yeah, we won't be a drinking buddy for long.
Yeah. But he just said any person who was not on a sort of a really heavy deadline or on an active project was getting moved across to anything GDPR related.
Because it's that higher priority.
Yeah, there's been all their clients were making a sprint to the finish line in the last sort of couple of months because they just hadn't prepared for it.
No.
So I got very little surprise.
What about you, Ray? Are you surprised that it's all been a bit of a last-minute panic?
No, because I think despite the efforts of the authorities to try and make companies aware, like you say, if you're a smaller company, you don't have anybody who can be assigned as GDPR officer unless they're the accountant or the part-time tea maker in an SME or something like that. So it's really not surprising. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person who is still getting the emails saying, please,
there's so many of them.
I love these.
Yeah.
Go bye-bye.
So, and I'm sure it won't be too long before we start to see some of these fines. What will be interesting, of course, to see if anybody notices any difference whatsoever in the way that data is used and how digital marketing actually acts in 6 or 12 months' time, or if basically nothing really changes for the general, for consumers, essentially.
The one thing I don't get is I still think there's a load of people that haven't got their head around it. Because I got an email today, and even I'm not pretending I'm an expert on GDPR, or I've read the fine print of the terms and conditions and all the various different clauses. But I got through an email today that said, we have you on our list. Here's an options. Do you want to opt in or opt out to future marketing purposes? And then below it, in italics, it said, because you're already on our list, if you do not reply to anything, we're going to carry on sending you emails anyway because we got consent before. And I was like, well, I thought the whole idea of GDPR was to re-qualify the sort of the people that are on your database.
It's almost like they're saying, we've just got to send you this completely gratuitous email, and then we've somehow covered our arse just by doing that.
We're ticking a box, and then, but even if you don't opt in, we're gonna carry on doing what we're doing anyway.
And there was another thing. I love some of the language associated with this stuff. So, within companies you have compliance departments, and then a week ago there was talk of forced consent.
Yeah.
Which was people like sort of big digital service providers basically saying, right, click this button to say you agree to us selling your soul to the devil, or you can't use our service anymore. And that was Max Schrems, who's the guy who kind of catalysed all this. He immediately started taking action against this forced consent.
He was the guy who kicked off Safe Harbour.
Yeah.
However many, 3-4 years ago, wasn't it?
So I guess what happens, two things that happen when you come up with a big load of regulation. I'm not saying you do need regulation. I'm not a complete laissez-faire, let the markets run their course. You've got to have some guiding hand from time to time. But with big loads of new regulation, you get unintended consequences, which typically favour the larger organisations, and B, you get everyone spending half their time thinking, how can we basically skirt around the edge of it, i.e. not really comply with the spirit of this thing and just do the bare minimum and then still keep doing what we feel like.
How can we exploit this? By offering GDPR advisory services?
Yes, yeah. I mean, that was
GDPR merch.
I mean, that must have been such a boost to some of these consultancies.
Yeah.
We can make sure you're compliant so you don't get that £20 million fine.
It's the Y2K for 2018.
Yes.
In some respects.
I mean, on the
just without quite the level of sort of millennial hysteria.
Yeah.
On the unintended consequences, that was part of what Mary Meeker was talking about yesterday or the day before. I can't remember what she actually.
And remind us why we care about Mary
Mary
Meeker.
4 or 5 days ago, I'm sure, at least.
Yeah, by the time
but her annual presentation.
When we publish this.
Yeah.
Why do we care about Mary Meeker?
Well, she's just basically she's a venture capitalist and recognised as one of the authorities on the business of internet.
Right.
But she turned around and said one of the unintended consequences is, GDPR, Europe is trying to protect its citizens, but ultimately is putting a stranglehold on innovation and how startups and companies can develop.
Yep.
So, I mean, that was just her comments. I mean, you can take two things off of that. Either the European startups fall behind the Silicon Valley startups, for example, because they can't use data to develop their services, or a startup looks to scale elsewhere. In either case, Europe as a society and an economy loses out to Silicon Valley. So they're the unintended consequences from one aspect of it.
And it's interesting, following on from what she observed there, and I'm sure there's a lot of validity to it. I've also read stuff about how Silicon Valley is really trailing China when it comes to sort of speed of innovation and all that sort of thing. That a lot of the really fast, slick stuff's going on in China.
Well, I mean, one of the things, this was another stat that she brought up, was that China, citizens in China are more open to sharing data than anywhere else on the planet. So they've just got more fuel to sort of drive innovation and development than anyone else. Which and plus,
that's why they're relaxed about trademark as well. It's all about sharing everything.
Yeah.
Well, they've certainly been accused of being relaxed about other people's trademarks. That's for sure.
I mean, the big one now. One thing I've noticed this week is that the lobbying has gone through the roof. You could say that the big internet companies lost the skirmishes when it came to GDPR.
Yeah.
But the next one is e-privacy regulation, which is going to just reinforce certain aspects of GDPR relating to marketing. And then that is going to, they're now starting the lobbying process to try and get a more palatable regulation.
Right.
So that's the next big battle, I think. And I think it was supposed to be released in conjunction with GDPR, then it got kicked back, and it's going to be in 2019 at some point that e-privacy regulation is going to hit the streets.
Ray, do you think this is sort of a growing trend? Do you think this is a phase of like the internet in general, where we've had our Wild West phase, where it's just a sort of free for all, and now regulators, whether it's in the Europe, UK, US, whatever, are going to sort of crack down a bit? What do you reckon?
I don't know.
That's it, is it?
Yes, it is it.
You're supposed to be a pundit, Ray.
No. I can't help you on this one. I'm
Okay,
afraid.
well, that's fine.
Yeah, I have
well,
no
maybe
idea.
there's nothing to reckon. Well, maybe we should take that opportunity to move on to the next thing. Jamie and I both wrote about Nokia this week.
I think you did as well, Ray, didn't you?
I think I did. Yes.
Are you stoned or something?
No. Past my bedtime.
No, he's just very busy, bless him.
I did touch on Nokia.
I touched
on it.
Okay, well, I'll kick it off. What did I write about? Oh, yeah. So Nokia's got sort of two main silos. Its main sort of networking bit, and then it's also got this technologies division, which is pretty much left over from when it sold the majority of its devices business to Microsoft, however long ago, 10 years, whatever it was. But it kept hold of a bunch of intellectual property, because Nokia was always, back when it was the handset king, they spent absolutely tons on R&D, and so they probably got a hell of a lot of patents to do with handsets and other things to do with sort of mobile communications in general.
Yeah.
And so they held on to some of that stuff and named it the Technologies division. And I remember when they first did it, I sort of somewhat sarkily named it the Patent Troll division. In fact, I remember once suggesting that to some Nokia execs, and they didn't laugh. But they can't all be home runs, can they? And then they thought, no, let's do more than patent trolling. Let's get back into devices. After all, we were pretty handy at that for about 20 years. But rather than get back into handsets per se, although they have been licensing out their brand to this HMD Global, which seems to be doing a half decent job of resurrecting the handset brand, they thought, let's get into digital health. And we'll buy this company called Withings, and they do all these cool things like wearables where you can track your heart rate and manage chronic conditions. And they thought this might be, IoT is obviously going to be a big thing sooner or later, and maybe this medical side will be a big part of consumer IoT. So that's the future. And that was 2 years ago. They bought this and went, right, this is what we're doing, and they brought in a guy from Samsung who was really strong on devices, and everything was set for them to really exploit this. And then within about a year and a half, they went, actually, we can't do this. We can't hack it. It's not happening.
Is that because they were crushed by like Apple or?
No, my feeling, and I'll put this to the table, is that they just ended up not being as good at it as they thought they would be. I don't think it's because of external competitive reasons. I think it's internal competence. They just didn't. They weren't as able to exploit that opportunity as they presumably thought they were when they bought Withings. Is that how you interpret it, Ray?
Wasn't it?
I don't know the reason. I mean, I'm sure it's a mixture of different things. I think it's very hard when you're a really large company. I mean, essentially, even though they spent a couple of $100 million on buying Withings, it was still a tiny part of a very large company. And with so much going on in the main part of Nokia, to spend a lot of time and effort from the top down on developing that market, which wasn't core to what they were doing, is not really happening. And I think in the end, they just realized, right, if we're going to make this a go of this, we're going to have to invest even more heavily in it. Is it worth it?
Yeah.
No. Right, let's get a shot of it.
So let's either double down or get out.
Very much so.
Yeah.
I think that was where, and whether it was because what they acquired wasn't quite what they thought. Maybe they thought they were getting more skills as well as tech. Maybe they were getting more of an initial market. But that whole area, I think, has moved incredibly. The developments have moved very quickly, but I don't think the market has grown as quickly as everybody thought it was going to 2 years ago.
Yeah, 100%. I'm with you there. Wearables has just not taken off anywhere
Same as
near.
VR. People were wetting their pants about VR a couple of years ago, and it's a slow burner.
I just
A slow burner in wet pants.
Yeah, I was saying. I mean, when they got into it, it was just unrealistic. Like, I think the IoT wearable space is really going to take off when you've got sort of eSIMs embedded into the devices. The idea. Well, I know you can actually put SIMs into like smartwatches now, and you no longer have to be tethered to your devices. That for me was the biggest step forward we've seen on wearables for since they actually existed. So as soon as you start to get eSIMs on there, and then you can do a bit more flexible shopping around sort of getting different data tariffs. As soon as eSIMs turn up, I think you'll have some very speciality sort of telcos who are selling like MVNOs or that.
Very much so.
Yeah, and I think that is a big step forward. And ultimately, they backed wearables, and wearables just didn't deliver really.
So you could say that they perhaps lack patience. I mean, if you're going to, as you say, Ray, it's not that much money, but if you're going to drop a couple $100 million, then you should give it more than a couple of years, shouldn't you?
In the scheme of things for that company, I'm not sure. I personally think they made the right decision in getting out.
Yeah, if they weren't going to, if they could identify it wasn't happening.
Yeah.
I mean, the one person I feel slightly sorry for is this chap, Gregory Lee, who was the head of Nokia Technologies.
Or Gregory Leave, as he's now known.
Leave. Oh, no, you didn't. Is 1 year, they got him from Samsung, the head of sort of Samsung North America, devices guru. He's going to be our devices dude. And within a year, they're sending out press releases going, yeah, well, seeing as we flog Withings, there's no point in him hanging around anymore. So see you later, Gregory. But,
I think it's too early for the tech. The interface is too small to do enough things. It's too tiny,
Well, yeah, there is. I mean, I've always thought, from back when I was a devices analyst and they were first coming out with wearables, I thought, if it's a Bluetooth device, i.e. tethered to your phone, then all it really is a notification device. Or maybe useful for one or two other things. I suppose now we're getting to contactless payment, maybe that's a useful thing. But then if it's standalone, as Jamie was just celebrating, that obviously gives it more functionality. But I still don't think you're leaving your smartphone at home.
Yeah, no,
I don't think you're
just
using.
Too small. I think
exactly.
Like what you say about cars, you need a very good
Voice UI.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And clever enough to do.
Depends on the application of the wearable, though, doesn't it? I mean, if somebody comes up with a fantastic, as I think there is a Hong Kong company comes up with a fantastic wearable that can monitor people's blood pressure.
Oh no, but that's just one thing, though.
But that's
a phone does so many more.
That's where success has been to date. Like, there's as far as off the top of my head, I can only think of one brand which has really nailed wearables and actually made a real good success story out of it. And unfortunately, their last 2 quarters have been going down the pan a little bit, and that's Fitbit.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it was just a very simple device which had a simple function and appealed to a niche audience.
Yeah.
And, they captured the majority, or not the majority, but they had sort of like 30-40% of the smartwatch market. They're the only ones that could actually make real money out of it. But that's the only thing.
It's a pedometer with heart rate.
Yeah. It's simple things because the technology
Good
isn't anyone.
marketing.
Yeah, oh my God, that was good marketing. Yeah. And it's cheap as well.
Yeah, well, that's been my other knock on smartwatches. If you're going to drop 400 quid on something that's basically a Bluetooth accessory.
No. Like an Apple Watch is $250.
No, they're more than that.
It depends on the strap. I mean, they're trying to market it as
yeah.
this luxury thing. You can get one that's straps made out of crocodile arse or something, and they cost about $2,000.
Sure.
The Huawei ones were about, when they first brought their ones out about 2 years ago, were going for about 400, 500 quid.
Really?
Yeah, but they
really
had like
expensive.
Gold plated or something.
No, it's just bog standard ones.
Yeah. So yes, I agree. I think we're all in agreement that category has yet to sort of find its mojo.
Yeah, I think there's going to be great potential for it, but there's so many things that need to happen. Data needs to be cheaper. eSIMs need to develop more. The technology needs to get better. Voice interface needs to get better as well. We need a better way to communicate with the device as opposed to just holding it with us. And
like
gestures.
Like something out of Star Trek.
Gestures would be great.
Yeah, gesture UI would be brilliant if you just wave your hand around and make
you
stuff
don't
happen.
have to touch it.
Yeah, there's so many great things about it, but I just think
Just want to make sure you're not wearing it when you're making certain gestures. Could be misinterpreted.
But just not there.
So, Jamie, I reckon the best way for Nokia to work out how best to use these things is to create a special committee to look into these things. What do you think?
Well done. Good segue. So this follows out of their AGM where they have launched a new technology committee, and this has 6 members on it, and the technology committee is supposed to be sort of critiquing the innovation and the R&D and the technology strategy of Nokia. Now, for me, sounds like a great idea. If you've got a independent board of people that can come in and look from an outside perspective and say, do you know what, you made a couple of good decisions here. This one, not too keen on it. This money, not too keen where you spent that. This is how you could do
VC
better.
Approach.
Taking, because, to open yourself up to critique from third parties is quite a mature thing to do.
Is it critique or are they advising?
Opinions and advice is what they're supposed to give. So they're supposed to evaluate and assess certain aspects of the technology roadmap and strategy and decision making.
Okay.
So I think a great idea, brilliant idea, but the people they've put on this board are, firstly, most of them are already on the Nokia board already.
So hardly outsiders.
Yeah, so not really independent, not really outsiders. And secondly, they're from organisations which I would not necessarily consider the most innovative or forward-thinking for the telco space.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, like the CTO of Procter & Gamble, fantastic, but is he really going to take Nokia into the next era? For me, it was just, I don't know.
Procter & Gamble, they're like sort of toothpaste and stuff. Aren't
Yeah,
they?
for me, it was just, I mean,
one of the largest enterprises and consumers of telecom technology and services in the world, probably.
Well, there is that.
yeah, but they've got no, they consume data and all that sort of thing. But, for instance, upgrading to 5G, that's where Nokia sees they're going to get a lot of cash. You know,
What's Mr. Toothpaste
what's
gonna tell
Mr.
them about
Toothpaste? What's Mr. Colgate going to tell us about?
Industrial IoT?
Yeah, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just not convinced by it. I'm not convinced by
that?
it.
You are then convinced by it.
I'm both. I think Jamie's point about making a technology advice committee out of people who are already on the board is a little bit pointless.
Rubber stamping their own influence.
Yeah. But I think having a dedicated focus, and if you have people who are from some of the large companies and who consume and understand and think about where global technology is going, and remember, enterprise and telco is converging.
Yeah.
The cloud is the future, etc., etc. A lot of these large companies are going to have virtual, if not physical, networks as large as some communication service providers. Then I think there's going to be some value in it. But I think but I agree with you. I think it sounds like that they haven't quite got the right model, and I would love to be a fly on the wall when that committee presents to Marcus Weldon and Basil Alwan and all these other people who spend all of their time thinking about this internally. And I would say I pick those two people particularly because I know they are smart. They live and breathe technology, but they're also very reasonable people. They're not pig-headed people who would go, I don't care what these people think, they're wrong.
Here. Yeah.
I would love to see the exchange there and see how much value comes out of this.
I mean, I think for me, it's a wonderful idea. And I think maybe the Procter & Gamble one is a bad example. But let's say, for instance, I'm gonna back myself up here. I'm gonna make my points. Another example was an individual who worked for IBM prior to them turning around their fortunes. Now, I questioned, I can't remember her name.
Don't worry.
But she was a senior executive at IBM until about 2014. So when IBM was still declining, but hadn't really turned around its fortunes. So, I mean, I'm sure she's a fantastic businesswoman, and she is probably orders of magnitude more intelligent than I am. But if I'm a global technology provider, I really want to be bringing in the people that have turned a business into a, I want to hire someone who's been working for IBM over the last 3 or 4 years when they turned around fortunes, not someone who was in a senior position as it was going into its decline.
One other sort of thing I'm never that sure about non-executive directors, full stop. Always strikes me as a bit of a sort of old boys club gravy train at times.
They get paid wedge as well.
They get paid proper wedge. They sort of have to turn up about once a month, sit around a table and go, yeah, definitely.
So the Nokia board of directors.
This is satirical. I'm sure they do a lot more than that. But it's to illustrate my scepticism as to exactly how much value they add, full stop, let alone to a committee like this. But Ray, correct me. Do you think non-exec directors?
Well, I think
am I misrepresenting them?
I think like a lot of goalkeepers, they don't get praise when they're stopping the shots, but if they fumble, then they're going to be in the firing line.
Fair enough. A bit like Liverpool.
Too soon.
I wasn't going to make the Carrius connection, but I think people don't spend a lot of time if you're not an investor or you're not in very senior management in a company, you don't spend a lot of time thinking about or looking at or engaging with boards of directors.
I think they're incredibly valuable, and I think part of it is we don't understand.
Yeah, I think I've just shown that I don't.
No. I mean, I don't know what. I'd love to be in that position because I know that the Nokia board of directors, if you're just a bog standard board member, you get paid 160,000 euros a year. If you are I think it was the vice chairman of the board gets 185,000 euros, right. And the chairman of the board gets 240,000.
And they could still do other stuff. Anyway, I mean, I could just be jealous. I wouldn't mind that gig.
Oh, I'd love it.
If I'm honest. But you know what they should do, Ray? They should invite us into some of their board meetings, so that we can tell the world what a great job they're doing. Don't you think? Come on, Nokia, if you're listening. Come on, Marcus. Let's make it happen. Cool. All right. Ray.
Yes.
You're almost constantly itinerant these days, and you're off at another of these events that you just can't seem to stay away from. Why don't you tell us what that was all about and what you learnt from it?
Well, in the past couple of weeks, I've been in a couple of different places. I was at the BCE event, which Light Reading runs in Austin.
Where you got schooled at basketball.
Oh, yeah. Jamie was there as well.
It's on Twitter.
It's on Twitter. I don't think yes, that was a very interesting photograph showing only one of two schools.
I was going to say it.
But we won't get into that right now. That's a whole different pod.
Rematch.
So there was the BC in Austin, then I was at Network Virtualization Europe in Madrid last week, or a couple of weeks ago. And there's... what's interesting I'm finding now is that there are definitely companies, telecom operators, who have taken the next step in terms of virtualization and who have finally realized, what they can do next, what does work, what works for them from a strategic point of view. And there are some that really haven't, that are a long way behind. And I think instead of like after 5 years of NFV becoming a term and a lot of excitement about, the potential of functions virtualization and the introduction of software-defined networking, the industry after 5 years is actually no more together in a vision. It's actually in some ways it's splintering more. I think there's definitely leaders. I think Telefonica is starting to show itself to be, ahead of the game, certainly in some very interesting aspects. What it's doing around the redevelopment of its central offices as part of its distributed cloud and edge computing architecture, I think is really up there and in the top echelons. And I think a lot of companies will be a lot of Telefonica's peers will be knocking on their door and saying, hey, I want to find out about this, and the other point I'm coming to, there are schisms. There's companies who are definitely leading the way and breaking off and having different strategies, but at the same time they're also coming together in industry organizations like the Telecom Infra Project, TIP,
right,
and other bodies to share what they are doing. And in fact, what Telefonica is doing actually is using a lot of open source developments from the Open Compute project, and they're using that technology to build the infrastructure that's going to enable them to become the next generation telco, the cloud telco.
Right.
But despite this sharing, there's definitely companies who have put a lot more resource, time and effort into the past few years, but I think importantly as well have had a unity of management. And the thing, I'm going to hark on about Telefonica here, because they've had the same CTO who's been in charge of their virtualization vision since their whole program began. Enrico Blanco, yeah, and he is still there in charge of it. And I think that if he left or went and did something else or retired or went fishing, went all Hemingway and went fishing, He certainly used to have the Hemingway beard, but if he wasn't there anymore, I think their program it wouldn't falter and stop, but I don't think it would have to continue to have the momentum. And this people thing I think is incredibly important. That's what's helped AT&T. They've had John Donovan was there for years, and that's helped AT&T be in some regards be at the front of this. And there are a bunch of companies. NTT is still showing its value and its progress as well. But there are a lot of companies who are still struggling with some of the stuff. How are we going to enable this new vision? How are we going to onboard virtual network functions? They're still at that phase, which is
gets a bit sort of deja vu-ish sometimes.
It does. But the thing so there was lots of great discussions at BC, but I think it's one of the great points that came out of the Envy event in Madrid was a guy called Pravan Merchandani, and he's the CTO of a company called One Access. He made a great point during that event, which is that no matter where companies are in their virtualization strategy and development, still nobody knows actually how much it's going to cost from an OPEX point of view, how much it's going to cost to run either hybrid or fully virtualized networks. And one of the big promises of virtualization is it's going to be cheaper and easier to procure your technology, and that will be cheaper to run it. And his point was, and I think he's absolutely right, nobody has got a freaking clue.
No one knows
about what the total cost of ownership of hybrid or virtualized networks would be. And there's only one way to find out, of course,
exactly.
and that is to do it. But it's
so everyone's waiting for everyone else to make the first move, aren't they?
I think in some respects there are some companies who are going, let's see what the others do. But if you wait too long for that, the thing is the time frames for things changing and moving on, it's not 2 years or 18 months anymore. It's 4 months and 6 months. If you sit on your arse and go, I'll let them figure out, have the pain points, and I'll mop in a little bit later, I think those days are over.
And that still assumes that you'll be able to learn from them, which isn't necessarily the case.
It isn't necessarily the case. I think the opportunities to learn from the leaders are very much there through industry organizations and different groups, whether it's an open source or long-standing organization like Etsy, for example. But I think that even with all the information in the world, I think what we found, and there's a great example just this week, the closure of the acquisition of Interroute, that closed. GTT acquired Interroute. And Interroute, I think, has always been very forward-thinking and quite innovative in the way it's built its networks and viewed its architecture to enable services. And the thing about Interroute is that the only way it figured out to do things properly is that for years and years and years they had the same team trying to get things right, and then finally they did. And the thing is, you can't bottle that and then sell it to somebody else. You can look at even if somebody wrote it down or spent 4 days explaining everything they did, you can't then do it in 4 days. It's going to take you 5 years as well.
I see.
So I think there's lots of different companies at lots of different stages, lots of opportunity for companies to learn from each other. But actually the diversity of strategies, opinions, and experience points, I think, is getting broader and wider, which is great for us.
Yeah.
Not great
More
for the
sort
industry.
of chaos for us to write about.
Very much so. Yeah, absolutely. There you go. That was a bit of a rant, wasn't it?
No, that was good. That was good. Well, I didn't interrupt you because I didn't have anything useful to add, to be honest. I'll quite happily defer to
I guess
not
it
only
showed I was
your...
actually paying attention at some point.
Well, I was going to say, I'll defer not only to your knowledge, but the fact that you were there and I wasn't. It seems fair enough. I'm not going to go, to be honest, Ray, it all sounds like bollocks, mate. You're talking out your arse, son.
There is a question, though. Best meal in Madrid?
You see, the event was in Madrid, but the location was at the end of Madrid Airport runway, 10 miles from the centre of the city.
I've stayed at that airport before.
Right. Yeah, there's a few of them around there. So
you're not exactly in the middle of some glamorous plaza.
So it wasn't. I do have now some great locations to head to in Madrid, but I didn't make it to any of them.
Gutted.
Yeah, I think I can say I had quite a good, and I'm going to, for anybody who's Spanish speaking, clog your ears now. Don't listen to this, but huevos rotos, which is potato.
That's not bad.
Oh.
Huevos rotos.
Potatoes with fried eggs and ham on top. That can be spectacularly average, and it can be absolutely amazing and unbelievable.
That is
I had a pretty good one actually in this hotel.
That is one of your favourites. We had a sort of high-level,
Indeed.
light-reading Telecoms.com board meeting once.
Around
involved-
huevos rotos.
That involved what is otherwise known as ham, egg and chips.
But you see, there's ham, egg, and chips, and then there's huevos rotos.
There we are. There we have it.
Buenos jueves. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I think as we concluded that you've pretty definitively covered that sort of thing, and it's getting towards pub o'clock. We'll knock it on the head there. So thank you to everyone for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.